but we are hoping we will not start again. If these medals coming in, let me start by welcoming you all. Thank you so much for making time on such a beautiful sunny day. I did talk to the gods before, and not embarrassed. They didn't seem to get my message. So thank you so much for braving the weather and coming down. Warm welcome to the last Insaka of the academic year. And for those who've been here many, many times before, it's lovely to always see you again. And for those who are here for the first time, a warm welcome to AfOx, that's the AfOx Insaka. My name is Anne McKenna, I coordinate AfOx with my colleague who's ushering today. There's AfOx team members that are around the room, wherever you are, in case you want to ask questions or find there you are. Please reach out to them. I will do a very quick run through of what we are here to do tonight, and then maybe a little introduction to AfOx. And then after that, we'll make room for what we are really here for, which is to hear our speakers. So for those who are meeting us for the first time, the Africa Oxford Initiative is a platform across the university that brings together all things Africa. This includes research work, academic work, but also work around innovation. But more importantly, what we hope to do is be able to create a platform that makes engagement with Africa a strategic priority for University of Oxford. Our programs are of a wide range, from education access programs to our scholarship program. Again, AfOx scholars in the room. Yeah, okay, brilliant. Yes, brilliant. Good to see you all. And this is a bespoke scholarship program that provides pre-Oxford, during Oxford, and post-Oxford support for emerging leaders from across the continent. We also have a research program that includes fellowship programs, and I think we just had the great fortune of welcoming our 2023-24 fellows to Oxford. They just were here a few days ago, and there are any AfOx fellows in the room? Yes. Brilliant, a warm welcome to Oxford. And we also have an innovation program that is run by my colleague, Watibia. If you want to know more about the program, please reach out to her. It supports entrepreneurs and innovators from the continent to work with colleagues across Oxford and across other partners to deliver on their innovation ideas, to basically turn ideas into practical solutions for the continent. So please feel free to reach out to any of the people in the city smiling around you. We'll be happy to tell you a lot more about AfOx. We currently actually have 3 things open for application. We've got our Health, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Program that just opened and closes at the end of this month. Please encourage people to go to the website and learn more about the opportunity. We've got our Visiting Fellowship Program. So we just said hello to new ones, and they're saying hello to the next cohort. It's also open until the end of the month. Please encourage people who would be great for these opportunities to apply. And for those who are interested in the short-term research programs, research funding that we offer, the Catalyst Grant, please go to the website, learn more, and encourage other people to take advantage of this. More than that, we are really a community of people who engage and enjoy engaging on all matters Africa. So do sign up to the mailing list and be part of our community, participate in this and other events that we put out, and more importantly, encourage others to be a part of the community as well. So without much further ado, allow me to introduce what the Insaka is. The Insaka started from, I think, immediately a year after we started. And we've been running for about 9 years now, so the Insaka is about 8 years old. And the idea was really a gathering, a space where we can share interesting things that are Africa related. And this by design, we have 2 talks that are for very different topics, but in some shape or form, we always tend to find a link. So your job for today is to try and find a link between the talks. And the idea is really have this wonderful conversations, short and to the point conversations, and then we go off and drink receptions afterwards and get to meet the people in the community. So without much further ado, I'm so overwhelmed to welcome our first speaker today, Professor Bukosi Maribache. Because he doesn't get out of bed for less than $1 million. So I'm just gonna say that it took a lot to get him on a flight from Victoria. But I'm really delighted to have Bukosi with us. Bukosi is a professor at the University of Victoria. He is a professor of computer science and holds the ABSA Chair of Data Science at the University of Victoria. He's a specialist in machine learning and artificial intelligence and has particular focus on the intersection of ML and AI and natural language processing. Beyond that, he's a CTO of Lelapa AI, a startup company. He's got a project on Lacuna, which is a funding body for AI research and interventions across the continent. He wears multiple hats and also a part of the deep learning endeavor, and he's got a few friends from the DLI here today. But today, of course, he's going to be telling us a little bit about the African AI landscape. And I'm particularly excited to hear the difference between AI in Africa and African AI, because apparently there is a difference. So I'm excited to hear Kosi speak with us today. Please let's give him a very warm AfOx welcome.
Hey, thank you. And thanks for the invitation again. And it's not $1 million for me, but for the community. And you will see why in one way or another. I've been, like I typically every year develop a talk, and this talk is almost about to expire in about a month. I started speaking about this last year at ICLR, which I'll talk about later in this talk. So I'm at the University of Victoria, as Anne said, as one of my jobs as the chair of data science there, and then also at Lelapa AI as one of the co-founders. Co-founded the deep learning endeavor and Sakani, and wear lots of different hats, which you'll also come to understand when it comes to really thinking about artificial intelligence data science on the African continent and how we grow it. At the university, I run the Data Science for Social Impact Lab, where 70% of our work is in AI and African languages. So we try to figure out how do you really get African languages on the map, and that we can work in the spaces we want to work in without much hindrance in AI. The other 30% is what we call data science for society. So how do we make sure data science and AI can be used by people who are not us, right? Who are not the experts in one way or another. So in thinking about AI currently, sure, a lot of things changed on 30th November 2022 when ChatGPT was released, and really thinking about those types of systems that now, after a year or so, we've become very used to just being able to access, is we need to understand what's happening in some ways in the background. And one is this point that you need this very this appetite for data. It's massive. And also we need compute, and I will go through a few examples here. So one, in thinking about the current generative AI, it's just another layer of thinking about what AI or machine learning is. It's just like, there's been some changes in the way that we represent machine learning, but the core has stayed basically the same. It's just that data has become more ubiquitous and compute has become more easily accessible in some ways. And as such, we could build bigger and bigger models, and these models then need more and more data. And that's where we get to in 2024. So this is not the first time we're going through these hype cycles, right? We call them the summers of AI, right? In the past, you used to go from the summer and then go back to a winter, but now we don't really go back to winters anymore because of the drive of the big tech companies. They've been the ones now who are funneling a lot of money into these areas. So now we have this age of generative AI. It won't be the last hype cycle, but how do we also learn from the past to prepare for the future? One of the things that's very interesting is that there's going to be a lot of ideas that float around, and most of them will wither away. And we're starting to see that right now. There's a bit in thinking about funding that's available, especially for startups, that has slowed down a lot in the last couple of months, because now, it's one thing funding ideas, it's the other one seeing if those ideas work out. And now when they don't work out, then you've also hired a lot of people, and the growth that we're expecting because of the current AI hype cycle is not coming in the way it was expected. Then money comes out, and when money comes out, you then start seeing that some of the core ideas will stay, and then most of them will wither away. An interesting graph I always think about is this. These are the amount of papers that are available on arXiv. It's a preprint server, so whether like most of the time it's before your paper gets published, so hopefully it's been peer reviewed and accepted, but it doesn't, like some of them are not peer reviewed, but people share a lot of the machine learning papers. So this is from the machine learning archive. And you can see there was a time where we were getting about 100 papers on archive a month. Now we're almost at, I think, 150 per day. Right, so you can see the exponential growth in the availability of people putting up ideas on AI. The other then comes in is that to build these things, what do you need to do? So we need to get into a bit of geopolitics. So compute is what you need, right? So these are what we call A100 GPUs. These are from one of the companies, NVIDIA, and you can look at who has them and how many of these GPUs that they have. So for a lot of it, you see this private cloud on your left, and then you see national high performance computing centers, and then you also see public cloud, meaning you have some areas where you can access it from outside as part of consortia. So these were A100s. We can go back like 2 years ago. This is where you were thinking you were at the top of the food chain. You have like a lot of these, and you can see the numbers. Things are changing. This is 2024. These are H100s. These are now the new GPUs, the top of the line, and this is what you need to build AI models. And you can see something has changed. All right, so you have a company like Meta, who right now released their Llama 3 LLM, which is trained on 24,000, so not 350,000, 24,000 H100 GPUs. And I do not believe the whole African continent combined has 24,000 H100 GPUs. Right, like, let alone 350,000. All right, so this is showing you that there's been a market change in who now is controlling the systems that are going to build the AI models, right? And a lot of it is coming into this private cloud. Right, and this is meaning when they say private, it means that you don't even have access from outside. Facebook does not make you can't even pay them to get access to their GPU. Public cloud is that you can pay that service to get access to those GPUs. So this is just one company heavily investing, and African continent, as I said, actually even at 10% of that, we don't have that many H100s available on the continent, meaning that they're in data centers on the continent. So we have to think differently. We're not going to necessarily win this fight. Let the big, the elephants in this keep on fighting in the way, because they will keep on building LLMs and all those things, but there are things that you need to think about. The other one is that we identified that really the biggest improvements that have been happening in these models outside compute has been increasing the amount of data that you have available to you, right? So you need to think about, where is this data coming from? Does it represent all of us, or are there biases? How do we make sure we protect citizens from private, like in private settings? And Africa also cannot just be a place for a cheap data market, meaning either data gets taken or people are being used to annotate or add information to AI without actually having any agency to build their own models and do the AI work themselves. So this is another way to view this. This is building these models. So as a Llama 3 is about a month or so old. It's become available, and these are how big, as time has gone on, how big these models have become in terms of parameters, and now we're somewhere on this side. To build a GPT or a Llama model, typically you're using a data set that is called Common Crawl. It's a crawl of as much of the internet as possible. It's mostly in English, and it's about 9 petabytes of data. What is 9 petabytes? You have 1,000 megabytes, a gigabyte, 1,000 gigabytes is a terabyte, 1,000 terabytes is a petabyte, right? And one of the things that you can do as a way to look at this is another way, is let's look at the sizes of Wikipedia. So it just as a heuristic, not necessarily as a Wikipedia is much smaller. Here's English Wikipedia. It's got 6.8 million articles that are written in English on Wikipedia. And you see those are the top 10, right? You won't see really outside Egyptian, Arabic, any other African languages in the top. If we go, there's Swahili. How we've gone from 6 million to 80,000 articles in Swahili. There's Yoruba, 33,000 articles. articles on Wikipedia in Yoruba. This is Zulu, 11,000. This is Sotho, 940. Right, and my mother language is one, I think it's 600. My father's language is Tsonga, it's another, I think 300 and something. And my wife's language is Ndebele. They're working on putting the first few articles in Ndebele. There was 0. Right, so if you're building these models, you need this data. And now, where is it going to come from? Right? At the same time, looking at these problems, we have to think about this, that it's also about people. So data is about people. We need to think about licensing. So there's a lot of initiatives now to create data. As Anne said, I'm part of the Lacuna Fund as a steering committee member, and we give out funding for people to create data in the global majority when it comes to AI. Right? We have to think about who benefits. One of the big tensions is we work on building up data that's open, but the people who benefit the most are the big tech companies who control what? The computer and the skills. They're huge research teams that can, as soon as your data becomes available, theoretically within a few hours, they can exploit what you release. Right? We have to capacity locally. Also, we get into this problem of a right to research. In some places, we take this as being normal, that you can get data as long as you're doing research in a public institution for public benefit, that you can get access to data, but in some places, this is not something that's enshrined in their local laws. And this is also something that, remember, Africa has 54 countries. Not a monolith, not one, like, people have different laws. And you have to think about this. I work in language, and this becomes very clear when you go to one country that doesn't take it as being legal to scrape a website. Right? Meaning, if you go and you scrape the content on a website, they could sue you for that. Right? Well, in some places, even like, I think the UK now is a bit different because it's no longer in the EU, but the EU has like rules about this, of saying, yes, we can do that. Right? It's just that you can't republish saying it's yours in a specific way, but you can use it for research. Right? We need to think about licensing agreements, fair use and fair dealing. We need to protect communities. As I said, we are not just a data market, and we need to protect workers. Right? That they're not seeing the worst of the internet to protect us without any protections themselves, right? So, because now work for things like content moderation used to go a lot to Asia, and then when labor laws started coming in, requirements for wages started rising, these jobs then came to the African continent, and they're trying to find places where there's no labor laws. Right, so you feel protected, you can go to an internet service, feel it, but then where are those jobs going to look at those things that that don't come to you? Right, and this is what happened with Facebook last year, or in the last 2 years, where Dana Mutawu, who's actually come to speak at the University of Pretoria in July, blew the whistle about what was going on with SummerSource, which was doing work for Facebook in this annotation, that they were looking at really these crazy, really hurtful content, and they were not getting any health support at all from these companies. And these are the things we have to protect against. Licensing decisions must happen. We just published this paper looking at how we're navigating copyright innovation and access. Right? We need to protect the sources of data. We need to protect our heritage, enable an ecosystem. We want to be open by default, but still reserve rights in saying that for some organizations, especially big companies, there should be ways that they are then paying for a lot of this content so that it goes back to create, to enable the ecosystem to grow. And we need to balance the power dynamics. Right? It's a major issue in these spaces where people tend to think of extremes, but we're trying to find some middle ground in these areas. So how do we, I've highlighted challenges within these spaces. How then do we resolve some of these challenges? And for me, the thing I've been really, really happy to be part of over the last few years has been on community-driven AI, and I'm very thankful for people in our community who've come today from different places across the UK to come, listen here and really support. And one is to talk to you about the deep learning Ndaba. And here is that there was an idea to say we want to start an organization that has a vision of Africans becoming critical contributors, owners, and shapers. At that time, we said the coming advances in AI. This was back in 2016. We were thinking about this, And then we looked around, we looked at the private sector, we looked at universities, we looked at governments around the African continent, and we didn't think they were ready about what's coming. Right? They just did not understand that this was going to be a very, very fundamental shift. And we needed to raise an arm for the continent, for all these things. So we started the Deep Learning Indaba as this annual gathering that really becomes a place where Africans come and gather to come and shape AI for themselves. So the first meeting happened at Wits University in Johannesburg. We had 330 people attending 700 applications. Right, and from many African countries. We went to Stellenbosch University the next year, doubled the size to 650 with about 1,500 applications. We went to Nairobi in Kenya, moved to 650 attending, 1,800 applications. We're in Tunisia, 400 people attending after COVID. And then last year we were in Ghana with 800, there were 3,000 plus applications, and that's growing, but apparently now I can't say 1,000 people this year. Okay, we were expecting. But another thing, because we are building a community really to represent us, you had 800 plus attendees, 45% of them being women. There is no AI conference in the world where you will find these type of numbers, and it's because we're trying to be deliberate as we're building these communities, right? And then 200 travel grants, especially for students, to be able to make it to wherever the Indaba is. And this year we will be going first to 7th of September to Senegal in Dakar. And that's like, really looking forward to that and seeing how the Indaba has been growing over time. The other organization I helped co-fund was Masakani. And this one was now trying to say, how do we shape AI for African languages, right? So with Masakani, the word means build together. So we build together in Zulu. And this started actually in the 2019 Deep Learning Indaba at one of the workshops. There was this thesis nail on the wall of saying, we have enough people, we have the skills to look at some problems in African languages and AI and really get over and build them in. So here, the first part was looking at translation, but this has gone on to build up an ecosystem of people who find themselves in the Masakani community and can find themselves in international meetings anywhere when it comes to natural language processing. So you see in the meetings and gatherings that they have, this is us celebrating 3 years in 2022 at the Indaba there, you see people being in other countries doing their MScs, their PhDs, but these being on African languages in AI. And also going to the major conferences and actually having your own, your own feeling of community. I can tell you when I remember going to the first, I think it was ICML, first major conference I'd gone to in AI, and it's you're in a room with 1,000 people, and you're one of the people, like one of the other 2 or 3 African people who are in the room. But that puts you out. But then now, because of Masakani, which has become a globally impactful organization, you can find yourself in these spaces. ICLR, which is the most prestigious AI conference at the moment in the world for the first time, was held on the African continent last year. And about 3,500 people go to Rwanda. And the biggest workshop as part of that conference was the African Natural Language Processing workshop. It was given the main auditorium, given the size of people, and really is another highlight on this, the growth of the Masakani network itself. The first paper from Masakani ended up winning the Wikimedia Research Award, the first one, from Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, for democratizing the internet. And since then, Masakani has gone on to be the most prolific AI lab on the whole continent. Right? It is continuously publishing, making impact, and working to really build an ecosystem that really works for the rest of us. Last year, we won the Digital Humanity Award from Ars Electronica, and then we were in another award during that period. But one thing I want to leave you with is that the grassroots in AI have always been there. And they are just because there's always going to be gaps that are not filled by thinking that, there's going to be a benevolent, big organization that will then fill in these gaps. The grassroots have been there because communities look at the current systems and say, these don't represent what we want. right? So you can see there's the Indaba, there's Data Science Africa, rather a sister organization that started a year or two before. There's Masakanya that started in 2019. But one of the things that you can see, so I didn't put here, for example, in South America, there's Kipu. And Kipu is an Indaba-like event now that started because of seeing the Indaba, and now they've started the same one for South America. Right, you have America's NLP that looks at natural language processing for South American languages because they see what Masakanya has able to do. So you can come up with something that's different, lead, and then inspire others, right? To build the same types of systems for their communities and constituents. Sure. Right? Revolutions are also fast and slow. So community-driven work has allowed us to move faster, where when you have where you have something like LLMs come in or big computer vision systems come in, that people can react to that and work to try and show that we've been doing that work as well locally. The slow is changing policy, right? Because there has to be foundational work that needs to be done. So you can't just have the revolution on one side and foundationally not make sure that there's infrastructure that make sure that the revolution will be successful at the end. So the slow has been that we've been working, for example, with the AU as grassroots organizations to really shape policymaking on the continent. So last year we worked with APET inside AUDA NEPAD, the African Union Development Agency, to really shape the first white paper on AI for the African continent. And one of the things that was very different about this convening was taking in grassroots and a lot of young people in the policymaking space, as opposed to the typical, very senior people who've been in there. Well, because Africa is a young continent, right? So you had Data Science Africa, you had Deep Learning Indaba, you had Masakali represented, Global Pulse Kampala being available and really shaping this. And as such, it's bringing these winds of change. One, you now have the white paper, you can go find it. I think it's closing soon for public comment. That came out of AUDA NEPAD, in thinking about how do you lay the framework. Just as an example chapter in there, thinking about human capital. These are the challenges that have to do with human capital, and these are the suggested interventions in thinking about what you should change, what should be changed across the continent to think about these things. The same infrastructure and data. We know you can't build data centers across the whole continent. There's a lot of places that don't have very good, good internet. They don't even have places where you don't have energy security. So you can't be telling governments, instead of having electricity for your citizens, give us electricity so we can build more data centers, we have more GPUs. Right? That is not the thing, but there are strategies that can be used across the continent to be able to think about expanded infrastructure and availability. We have to think about how we're going to get this demographic dividend. These are looking at different subsets of the globe, but one of the things that's interesting in thinking about this kind of age graphs is there's the African continent, and you're seeing how most of the population is under 20. Right, so if you're looking there, there's the world, there's the EU in 2018, that's the African continent. And we know that by 2050, 1 in 4 people on the globe is going to be African, 1 in 3 newborns are going to be African. We have to change the way that we think and prepare for this time and see how we're developing new economies on the continent. One of the reasons, we had to look at this is we need to absorb, as we're saying, we're building this pipeline, we're getting these skills, we have to absorb them on the continent and to then take, into account what we have in grassroots, in industry and some academia. For us, that's how we started the lab. The lab in Setswana means a home, and we wanted to provide a home for some of the best AI researchers on the continent to stay on the continent as opposed to having to leave. Lastly, what got us here is not going to get us there. So we have had to think about, in some ways, we've built something, we have a formula, it's expanding in its own way, it's experimenting its way forward, but then what are the other things that have to be done? So we built up the community, there's a lot of formalization, a lot of impact of work and examples that are out there, rising seniority and increases in opportunity. At the same time, we have challenges in mobility. moving across around the African continent can be very hard, very expensive, and it's also hard to move into spaces and go study or work in some countries. I believe there's more funding for African AI than Africa can absorb at the moment. Right, so we're living in an age of abundance, but we can't use that money. And we need to think about this very clearly, and most of it is coming from outside the continent, not from the continent itself. We need to build up opportunities for students, professionals to stay on the continent. We need to develop and support strong faculty. It's very, very hard, and it's something we're having to think about. We also have to choose our own path. It doesn't mean that you're copying. It means when you think about African AI, is what is it that we need in our communities that we need to be working on to really make an impact. Also, local R&D investment must increase, right, from the private sector. You don't get things for free. So the part of, sometimes organizations saying, no, it's better to buy from Silicon Valley, I have to remind them that, yes, you're just subsidizing somebody else's R&D pipeline. Right, it's not that it's well baked, it's because 999 startups fail for that one that you're intact. Right, and we don't have the same type of environment. So some takeaways, African AI has always been there. We can learn from it. There we go. You can learn from it. We have to experiment our way forward and figure out what, things by seeing what people are trying, learning from them, supporting them. We need a collaborative environment. For me, I say collaborate ruthlessly, because competition is not necessarily the thing that will take us. We don't have enough people, and we need to increase this R&D funding from the private sector and locally, because you have that different requirements and people hold you to different standards that if you just have international funders. In closing, I'm very thankful for all the collaborators that work with me. Thanks for all of your support in these spaces and all these different centers that we're all trying to figure this out together in different ways. For us, it's working with things like even community newspapers that are very small, because we're really trying to represent these languages. And also, thanks for all the support of these organizations that fund our lab at the University of Victoria. And yeah, thank you also for coming for this one.
Now you see why he doesn't get out of bed for that kind of So we're gonna have time for questions. I know you've got a long list of them, so please hang on to them and hold with bated breath for the next 25 minutes when we have our next talk, and then we'll take all the questions together. Thank you very much, because that was a riveting talk, and I can't wait for the conversation afterwards. Now, our next speaker is just not too ambitious. She just has, let's say, 6 world records and world university degrees. Dr. Veronica, and as if that wasn't enough, she is now an AfOx fellow. Veronica is a wonderful scholar, librarian, currently in Canada. She works on refugee and displacement. I couldn't start counting all the multi-award winning, all the awards that she's won over the last few years. But I think one thing that's worth mentioning is her current work with the PI of translational indigeneity, which is a term I have had to practice 100 times, given my mother tongue. And today, and her work has cut across displacement, how nations form, patriarchy, feminism. And one thing that I'm very, very excited to hear about is the kind of work that she's planning to go on to do during her work as an AfOx fellow over the last year, but also over the next few years. So it's my great deep honor to welcome one of ours, AfOx fellow, but also an incredible scholar, Professor Veronica.
My voice is pretty bad. I just got a sore throat on my way here from Canada. This is my PowerPoint presentation. So, like you, I don't have AI skills. So I wish I could do as well as we did. Am I supposed to be pressing this button? Okay. Please bear with me if I'm going to multitask. I wrote my notes. I believe in being on time as well, so I don't want to deviate. I'm going to try to stick on task by looking at my notes. And I wish you could help me with this PowerPoint presentation, because in that way I can focus on what I have to say. So thank you for the warm introduction, and I'm always dazed when I'm introduced, asking myself, who are they actually talking about? I bring you greetings from my ancestors and the indigenous Loma people of northern Liberia, the Creole people of southeastern Liberia, and the survivors of the transatlantic slave trade. Without their resistance, I won't be here today. Thank you, Adelina, Chimwemwe, David Kerr, the entire team for giving me this special opportunity to share my work with you. I'm both honored and humbled. The next slide, please. By the end of the 20 minutes allocated for this presentation, I would have positioned the bias I bring to this research, introduce the research program, define a few key terms for you, give you a brief historical background of the Transnational Indigeneity Project, lay out the problem, the project, state the research questions and objectives, sketch the theoretical framework that maps my thought process, present the methodology and the design I've adopted, highlight a few emerging results, prompt you with a number of questions that already keep me awake at night, acknowledge my teammates, and welcome the opportunity for you to share your thoughts as well and make comments and ask questions. Next slide, please. So today, as a living witness in both the spiritual and the physical world, I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors, the Creole people, and the survivors of 300 years of enslavement in the United States, and the Caribbean on my mother's side, and the Loma people on my father's side. I proudly identify as an indigenous Liberian, a survivor of war. Sorry, I did not expect that. Sometimes trauma trigger those kind of reactions. And it displays migrants to at least 6 countries around the globe. The first image here shows you the Loma women performing a ceremony, a traditional ceremony in Lopa County. The second picture depicts formerly enslaved Black African refugees awaiting their departure to Liberia in 1880. The third picture is a reminder of the indelible trauma I bear as a war child. The last picture affirms the potency of slavery, colonization, imperialism, in messing up the internal psyche of a group of people, Liberians in parentheses, who still believe that the people, Americans and the British, who enslaved them for nearly 4 centuries, are to be revered and supreme. Just look at the Liberian flag. What do you see? The next slide, thank you. The next slide, please. So transnational indigenous peoples such as Liberian war survivors who are displaced and compelled to migrate are not recognized by law and therefore invisible in many places. They lack protection under the Eurocentric Refugee Convention. This lack of recognition and protection allows for persistent ignorance of trauma they carry despite their ongoing resistance and advocacy for agency and autonomy. Next slide, please. International indigeneity. Indigeneity and the concept of indigenous peoples has been evolving into a broader and a more globally inclusive concept, but it's still essentially contested with no single definition provided at this moment. In a study of the problem of discrimination against indigenous population, Jose Martinez Cobo, then the UN Secretary General, UN Special Rapporteur in 1982, recognized that defining a group of people as indigenous is very complex. Lai 2004 argues that a group self-determination as indigenous is not a natural or inevitable process, nor is it invented, adopted, or imposed, but based upon positioning emerging through patterns of engagement, struggle repertoires of meaning, and historical landscapes. Hodgson in 2009 says African peoples have faced resistance and continue to struggle to be recognized as indigenous peoples with oppositions from the UN and an establishing set. And even worse, Africans themselves. Alfonso Matene argues that except for the San in Botswana and the Maasai in Kenya, African peoples should be classified as minorities rather than indigenous peoples. The United Nations Permanent Mission for Indigenous People cites the Americas, North Europe, Australia, and New Zealand as example of places to find indigenous peoples. Merlin in 2009 as well asserts that indigeneity can be seen as implying first-order connections between group and locality and connoting belonging, deep connections, attachment, and identification. To frame the concepts is more inclusive or in inclusive ways. According to Merlin, the impetus for so-called internationalization of the indigenous category comes from the Anglo-American settler colonies, which I call the establishing set. That's Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, and of course the Scandinavian countries. In Canada, for example, one of the establishing sets of international indigeneity, Section 35(2) of the Constitutional Act 1982 states that Aboriginal people includes the Indian, Inuit, and the Métis peoples of Canada. This definition geographically restricts indigeneity to operationality of Canada. By so doing, it underscores colonial settler violence inherent in the Westphalian model of the state formation. By confining indigenous peoples to geopolitical unit, created by transplanting oppressive laws and applying the forces of imperialism, gave rise to a fraudulent regime that Macau Mutua calls an illegitimate international law, and John Burroughs calls it an incomplete project of the constitutional law. It is against this background that Trujillo cautions against relying too heavily on definitions of indigeneity based on non-assimilation or continuing presence on ancestral lands, which is an essentialist perspective. I'm certainly nervous, you can see that, right? There are a couple of definitions before we get to the slide, so that's okay. Transnational displacement is the movement of persons or groups across international borders, and displaced migrants, what are used in this research, is a modified version of the guiding principles on internal displacement, which defines displaced people, but I've modified it to mean persons or group of persons who have been forced or coerced to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of systemic colonial violence, land dispossession, armed conflict, oppressive laws, and particularly related to broken nation to nation indigenous treaties, situation of generalized violence, human rights violation, natural or human-made disasters, irrespective of whether they have crossed an internationally recognized border. My last definition before moving on is intergenerational trauma or explanation. This is trauma experienced by displaced survivors of settler colonial violence that is transmitted across generations, impacting the mental, emotional, and physical well-being of their children and their grandchildren. The intergenerational effects include higher rates of substance abuse, loss of language and culture, disrupted family structures, sexual and physical abuse, mental health challenges, socioeconomic disparity, and a cycle of trauma that continues to impact displaced indigenous migrants and their community. Next slide, please. I won't dwell on this slide too much, but it's just to highlight that if ever there was a first people or indigenous people, they are Africans. At least I know, I'm aware that creation stories are varied across indigenous communities and cultures, but evolutionary biologists have enough evidence to point to the fact that we are the first people, we are the original indigenous people living the earth, the continent approximately 60 million years ago to populate the rest of the earth or the planet. Next slide, please. So very little research has been done on displaced transnational migration of indigenous peoples. Forced migration resulting from slavery, neocolonialism, and neoliberalism, globalization, climate change, harsh environmental conditions, economic hardships, compel indigenous people to live, work, and migrate across the world. This type of forced movement challenges the dogma of land grounded in static conceptions of indigeneity. With lack of recognition and protection, this research problematizes the narrow definitions of refugee, indigenous person, to sever the chain of intergenerational trauma. This problem is exemplified in the erasure of indigenous Liberians, the refusal of the United States Congress to recognize the Duwamish people as the first people of Seattle, and the latest Australian referendum that failed to give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander the voice or a voice in the Australian Constitution. Next slide, please. So what is fundamentally required to recognize and promote displaced transnational indigenous peoples? Next slide, please. The objective of my research here is to assess the state of displaced transnational indigeneity, to share survivor stories in the academy for the purpose of transforming leadership, and to document trauma past to build our traumatic past to build solidarity against settler colonial violence. I'm a complex person. I did not have 6 degrees for a reason. I'm just eccentric. So on this slide, you will see a number of theories. And because of time, I'm not going to go into details of these theories. But these are theories that are very dear to me as someone who has lived and survived war and a lot of abuse and violence. So it's important to me, unlike the conventional research standard, just take one theory and don't make it too complex. I believe in holistic, complex research design and method. So I draw on all these theories. During the question and answer time, if you have questions for me on any of these theories, please don't hesitate to ask me. Next slide. So a complex method design combines a multidisciplinary approach and concepts with empirical, doctrinal, statistical, and desk review to triangulate diverse data set. Triangulation enhances robustness, it deepens understanding, it corroborates findings, and reduces bias associated with self-reporting, for example. Critical community participatory research disrupts power dynamics, often seen between the authoritative researcher versus the vulnerable subject. Phenomenology displaces researchers' paternalism for participants' autonomy in valuing survivor narrative to ensure that generalized data are interwoven with lived experiences of trauma, displacement, and indigeneity. To do this kind of study, one has to modify, for example, the asking the woman question. And for years, as Catherine Bartlett's feminist jurisprudence, asking the woman's question approach. And to modify it for this research, I'm asking the displaced indigenous migrant question. It is a rhetorical phraseology that dislodges risk when interviewing by promoting survivors' agency and autonomy. Next slide, please. So this is a new research. I've been having trouble with my research for obvious reasons. And I think I strongly believe it has to do with white supremacy and the dominance of conventional research in academic institutions to not allow indigenous people to do the research they want to do and how they want to do it. These ethics polls are usually filled with a bunch of white people who have no lived experience, have no understanding what it actually means to survive war and trauma. and to do this kind of research in that context. But yet, they tell you you can't do that research. So, but I'm still going on with it in terms of some preliminary findings. And these are the major issues that are actually coming up over and again in my work. There's certainly the issue of trauma, settler law being very oppressive and manipulative, exclusion of Africans as indigenous peoples, failure to recognize the root causes of indigeneity or indigenous displacement and migration, and which transform into internalized hate between or in-group fighting between people that claim to be indigenous, but also hate other people that claim to be indigenous. It's almost like the divide and conquer rule, just divide them and they'll continue to fight against each other. And of course, the silos. For some reason, the European Refugee Convention, that's what I call it. It's called the 1951 Refugee Convention, but I call it the European Refugee Convention. For some reason, just feel that it, after 70 plus years, doesn't need to be reformed. And I think it's couched in the sense that people live off, that's 20 minutes. People live off the suffering of vulnerable population. It kept their wealth from constantly claiming this record number of displaced people every year. We broke a record this year. We have the highest number of displaced people. Let's give them enough money so that they can go there and live off the suffering of poor, vulnerable people, mostly women and children. Next slide, please. My discussion slide. So I have some questions for you during the discussion, and hopefully I'm hoping you can react to some of these questions. I know you have your own questions, but I'm hoping you can react to it because I need a lot of input, and I've been told Insaka is about sharing thoughts and ideas. So I want to hear what you have to say about my work. Next slide. I'm almost done. I believe in giving people their flowers while they're alive. It's important to me to always recognize that I'm not here alone. I am here because of so many people. And you may not understand how much gratitude means to me. It's so important, it's so fundamental to the core of my existence to be appreciative for whatever anybody has to offer to me. I am very grateful to these people, including my amazing husband, Thomas Burry, who has, taken all his extra time from his profession to invest into my own professional growth and development. I'm not like this amazing AI gentleman. My husband has all the computer skills, so I tend to draw on that and I appreciate that. So these are the wonderful people. I don't have time to mention all of their names, but these are the amazing people that I want to acknowledge and say thank you for making me to stand here today. My last slide. In my father's mother tongue, which I don't have, I can speak my father's language. I said mama means thank you. So thank you for the opportunity.
For the time we've all been waiting, but thank you so much, Veronica. The thing that amazes me every time we have an interaction is the depth, the authenticity, the intentionality, the compassion that you bring to your research that challenges me in ways I cannot begin to explain. So thank you. Where I come from with all these things. My father left me, Oh, there's a certain term that might cause problems for my ancestors if I use it. But this one you use after you've had a couple of drinks to see how much more you can take. So if you're able to, please, we welcome our speakers. And like, I also want to acknowledge the presence of the many people who joined us online. Please feel free to share your questions there and they'll be pinged over to us and we can ask our speakers. Thank you for paying attention. I'm sure you have lots and lots of questions. We've got half an hour, so please, I'm begging of you, don't say a question, not a comment. You know what I mean, right? It's a question and answer, not a comment and answer. And please feel free to make it as brief as we can so we can get through as many questions and thoughts as we can. Good. So there's a question at the back there. Yeah. Okay, let's divide and conquer. So let's do this side 1, 2, 3, and then we start from there.
Hi, firstly, great talk to both of you. Not sure if this is on, but for Professor Nkosi, the slide you showed about the GPUs is the one that blew my mind, right? So Meta basically had 90% of the GPUs in the world. How do we address that? What do you think is going to happen?
Next question, yes.
I don't think it's on.
I don't think the mic's working.
It's not on.
It's not working.
Thank you very much. My question goes to Professor Payne. In the course of your presentation, one of the methods, in your methodology section, one of the methods you use in your research is photoethnography. So photoethnography basically doing your research in your own compound or as an insider. So how do you think this has affected both the content and the way you went about your research? Being an insider and being traumatized by this particular situation. Thank you.
My first question goes to Veronica. I could figure from what you said that the blame game is on the Western world. No blame to our African leaders who have shown very poor leadership. I want to know. Then to my brother, because I'm a postgraduate student in artificial intelligence. I come from Nigeria, just started research on AI in Nigeria. Is there no way of having an African in Ghana? After the Nigerian one, Kenya had theirs last week. Ghana had that before Nigeria. Can you not sit down with the African Union and talk to the presidents that will create an enabling environment for AI to thrive in Africa? Thank you.
Yeah, I have a very quick one to both of you. If you would have unlimited resources, unlimited talent, unlimited funding, what would be your blue sky project?
Let's do Insaka's in one.
So the question about the GPUs, yeah, embrace the GPU force. We are all like, it's a funny thing now, like how power has shifted. We would think, where I'm from, I would think, oh, Oxford would have as many GPUs as they would want. Harvard would work as, and then when you look at that, you're like, actually, you find why even in the like top CS programs, some of the professors are starting to work inside these big tech companies. And some of it is getting access to this compute power. But one of the things, again, of thinking differently is for many of our languages, and not just African ones, you don't necessarily need to be thinking about a large language models that is going to, require the power of a medium-sized country to train. That is not, you can do lots of good work on small models. We worked last year for Setswana, which is my mother's language, and the model is 350 megabytes, and then it can be tuned to work on specific tasks and do close to state of the art of very big models. And at Lilapa, this is some of the things that we've been talking about tiny modes, where you also don't need to think about as much energy that you are going to use, and you can come up with frameworks or even like recipes that communities can take and use to build up the languages that are important to them. We can't thinking that a small community is going to get 100 GPUs so they can train it. It's not. There are other things like in the spirit of finding ways to really innovate your way forward. There's been times where we've tried to figure out, oh, how do I collaborate with somebody who might be based at Oxford or somewhere in the EU who has access to a lot of GPUs and they're sitting idle and sneak in jobs to train our things.
Yeah.
And that happens because we can't do that. So you have to find a way to get that energy and use it as part of ways to so people are trying lots of it. Once you sit with a lot of researchers, young researchers on the African continent, they find very, very creative ways to get their work done. Right? And the point is for me personally is how do I support them and get them going. Quickly on the thing on the AU is a tough space. That's why I said it's slow. And I've had to learn to be patient. Because, for example, our GDPR, our data protection law for the continent, it's called the Malabo Convention, was signed in 2014. And it took 10 years to ratify. It only last year in 2023 was ratified by meeting the minimum 13 countries that have adopted it in their parliaments. So one of the challenges we had when we were writing the white paper is this, that if we're going to take 10 years from an AI policy coming from the African Union to then meet the minimum requirements, by the time 10 years comes, it will be irrelevant. So what's happening is that there's a big push to do things like create white papers. There's the data framework that I also highlighted. The reason being to help the countries have agency to quickly work on their own paths. There is a policy discussion that's happening now inside the AU. It will probably be done in the next 2 or 3 months, but the white paper is out for public comment. And we're hoping that this becomes a resource that countries can use as they're shaping their policies as well. And we're happy about what's happening in Nigeria and a couple of other countries, South Africa also. I think I'll take it back to you and I'll think of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait for another question. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. The question you asked, gentlemen, thank you so much for asking the question. I get asked that question a lot of times. And I think it's because our conventional research tradition kind of creates a perspective that when you have a lived experience or when you are part of the research or you're a subject of your own research, there is a bias associated with it. And so you need to have a distance from your research to be able to be objective. I personally don't believe that's true. I think everybody has bias and it's a false statement or a false perception that traditional research try to make people think that if you're not involved or you're not part of it and you have an objective lens, it's not true. We are human beings and we all have our biases that we bring to our research, and it's important to be able to acknowledge that and deal with it. So for me, one of the good ways I've been trying to deal with it in terms of how I collect data is to continue to go for counseling. It has helped me a lot to be able to debrief after I go to the field, because sometimes it's really difficult. I'm not kidding you. In the middle of interviews, I'm also breaking down and crying. But I think also participants in the research are grateful that they can have a conversation with somebody who comes with a lived experience, as opposed to somebody who think of them as a subject and don't want to or want to detach from collecting that kind of data. So it's hard, and I've chosen to get into the field because of the amount of negative impact it has on a lot of girls who are survivors of war, and very few of them will make it to the level I've made it to. So it's a personal choice I've made, but I'm constantly overwhelmed and I need to go for counseling most of the time to just try to deal with my own package when I go to the field. The second question, I'm sorry that I gave the impression that I was allocating blame. I think my view is that the African Union is one of the worst institution or international organization ever to exist. And and I'm sorry to say that, I mean, if you're funded by the EU, how is it that you can never have a single-minded decision on anything that you do for your people? I'm very critical of African leaders as well. I think by showing the Liberian flag, I was trying to insinuate that how is it that we Liberians can claim we were enslaved by these people and still remind ourselves every single day that we are connected to people, the abusers are always attached to, the abuse is always attached to the abuser. So I think that psyche is still very deeply in our existence as Africans, just as individuals, but as leaders, we are the worst leaders also on the continent. And I'm never ashamed or embarrassed because we need to bring that critical lens as Africans to stop criticizing and telling the white people everything is about racism. We need to really face our own existence and how we facilitate the lot of abuse that we all or covenants that we have on the continent. So I agree with you. I'll ask the last question because it's really short and I already know if I had unlimited resources, I would educate every African girl. That's all I would do.
Yeah, and for mine, it's like I take the opportunities and the work that I do as an immense privilege, and I'm very lucky to be able to do the things I do. And I want every African young person who's interested in working on these problems to have that opportunity to be able to work on AI, to be able to work on language. And even like when I chose this path, I didn't know I was going to be at the space, having that freedom, that agency to explore and be able to find the thing that they'll be able to make an impact on the African continent and beyond.
We'll have the second half. We have 10 minutes back. You're holding yourself away from them. Why? So it's all on you. And just to answer your question, the deep planning endeavor happens across the continent. It's not just in specific countries. And AfOx has been a proud supporter of the endeavor for 5 years, I think. Yeah, so we've more. Yeah, so we've had an incredible, presence, including our scholars attending. So please do look up the DLI website. There will be plenty of Pan-African opportunities there. Okay, let's go the other way this time. We start here. I think you guys have to agree between the two. And then the lady in the middle, we've only had one female question, so I have one there, and then 2, 3. That's it. No, it's okay, do your business. It's not to send up the wine.
Professor Bukosi, just quickly before the wine. My question is really simple, actually. How do you imagine we can protect African intangible heritage, arts and culture, specifically in light of things that have been happening in America with capturing people's images to use them perpetually in films, or that the voices of Drake can now just be used without ever meeting the guy and you can have a feature. How do you think we can protect our intangible heritage?
Thank you very much. I'm Bose, one of the host fellow, and I have a question for my sister, Professor Odero. Thank you very much for the very interesting and very topical issue we discussed today. And I think it's something that we Africans have to consider the key challenges. Because when we talk about transnational, transborder migrants, I want to look at the case of Black American and African. You raise issue about how there is a kind of disconnect. And then when we look at the issue of bridging the gap, I recall my experience when I was in Brown University And one of the African American professors was discussing about the issue of racism, challenges the same. And then I had to ask this question: do you consider the fact that so far as Africa is underdeveloped, you continue to face this problem? Because there's a mindset that you are African, whether you like to admit this fact or not. And the reality is that so far as we consider Africans to be backward, to be underdeveloped and all this, you continue to be viewed as African and you continue to experience racism. And you have to consider that African development and also bring down straight. So I think the fact is that there's a deep-seated hatred for Africans by African Americans. And then I think the orientation has to come from their awareness that they need to support Africans, but they don't have this mindset. So for you, your work to be successful, there is a need to start the orientation from them. How do they understand, be able to embrace their heritage and see how they can support Africa? And when they do that, they are also able to change the situation they are experiencing. Thank you very much.
Okay, can the next person make it a less than a second?
I'll proceed to my question. Thank you. Now, my question is to Professor Bakosi on the issue of AI. Now, not all part of Africa, particularly from where I come from, Nigeria, have access to internet facility. And so how did you think this thing we're talking about will be more effective when we get it to be as regarding internet coverage? Thank you.
My question is also for Professor Bukosi. You talked about African policymakers being behind in terms of legislating AI. What kind of issues do you think African policymakers should be thinking about that are limited to the continent?
I will abuse my privilege and ask for one question from a female participant there. Okay, sorry, we've got one already.
There was one.
I actually, there was only one, and there was only.
Yeah, I'd like to take the chance to tag my question on to the gentleman who spoke first about protecting intangible heritage, and just kind of make sure in the process of doing this and codifying it, how does it not get sold back to Africans as the consumers? So that, yeah, thank you.
And then one last one there.
Hello. I have sneaky two. One, hello, I'd like to ask you, please, what do you think about how I can encourage corporates here to think about structural racism? What question would you like to ask them? And my other question is, if I have a large amount of data that is very purely African data, who do I give it to?
Okay, I guess quickly on the, on the heritage, we need to think about frameworks that work for this. So I typically respond to that. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a policy maker in this spaces, and we need to also acknowledge the people who are legal scholars and policy scholars on the African continent who are thinking about these, and make sure that we really support them in building this. So for me, when one of a new colleague relatively joined in the university who's in the law faculty, who thinks about AI and data science, we went there and said, like, we'll be your data scientist, you become our lawyer. And we will start working a lot together to think these things through, because we have real problems. We have on one part, we would like to get access to local heritage data, connected to what you're saying, that we want to study ourselves. And we need the instruments to allow us to do that. And now we're being blocked by people who might think that, oh, public access for research is not available to you. They would rather a big tech company can come and take their data they won't go and sue them, but you as a small researcher on African continent, they will come for you. Right, so that's the thing that you then do that. At the same time, you need to make communities educate so that they can have agency when they make decisions. Right, for me, when I teach about AI in general, it's the same explanation whether I'm in a church, I'm in a community, or I'm talking with other researchers, because it's actually a universal definition. And once people understand, they start asking the right questions. And they start understanding that by the time that they say, I want to give you this data, they are actually doing it from a point of understanding and not from a point of we're coming in as researchers to just jump in and take what we want. There's a huge history in lots of the global majority where researchers are taken as people who come in, they grab the data and they disappear and the communities don't get anything back. And it's like, no, somewhere, somehow, after I publish my paper and somebody else has seen the work, it will trickle down. And this creates a lot of distrust. And when it comes to heritage, it's a place where you cannot, without that trust, you cannot do that work. And that's the thing I've learned a lot in my work in language. Trust is something you cannot replace. We work with journalists, we work with small newspapers, we work with communities, and we spend a lot of time just building up trust as opposed to first saying, no, how fast can I get your data? Because people need to understand how they can then better build their cultural heritage with our work. Digitization is going to be a big issue in terms of internet connections and all those parts. There's also interesting research that comes because of things like that. People are working a lot on miniaturization of tools so that even if you only have access to the internet and very rarely, or you have a mobile phone that's not powerful, that you can actually use some of these systems. And that's the thing when I said that we're working on the chapter on infrastructure, on things like availability of the internet is important. At the same time, for most people, they wouldn't even know. Meta or Facebook is digging up the African content, right? For their own reasons, right? For them, it's how do we get provide internet to as many people in a way that Facebook or some of their products become their first experience of what the internet is. And that provides them, as I said, 1 in 4 people will be African, with this where they think the future of customers or sources of data are going to come from. I am funded by Meta just for a thing, but as an academic, nicely I can speak. Yeah, I can speak. And then, so we have to think about that, of saying like, how then actually should we making requests for companies like that to say, as you're doing this, how do we actually set up the rules on how people can actually use? There should be neutrality. It can't be that actually when somebody says the internet, in some countries, this is real, for them, the internet was getting access to Facebook. Right, that has huge effects on people. And then lastly, on policy, one of the things, as I said, with the Auda process was bringing young people into the room who were people who had been working on AI for years and years to bring in that experience. And we had to do almost like intergenerational teaching of here's what is happening, here's what some of the challenges are. And there's many also think tanks on the continent that are African that have been setting up over the last 6 or 7 years. And they're coming to the forefront now, right? When we said we had to raise an army, we meant it, right? Because this time was coming that we're going to need all these people who understand the nuances. Because at the moment, the biggest risk that we have is thinking, for example, like, oh, yeah, we have EU DMA and DSA laws that are coming in about these and AI policies, and just saying we will just adopt them as is. That is not going to work, right? Because a lot of also, even in the West, a lot of policies at the moment are being shaped by big tech. That is not necessarily the thing that we want at all. We really need to think about our communities. What is it that they would like after they understand what's at stake, and then seeing how then the policy represents them, right? It's not just simply the politicians at the top, it's everybody.
Thank you. So, Bossy, thank you for that beautiful question. It's a very fundamental and so important question. I know you were elaborating on it, but the truth is, I feel that is at the core of who we are as Black people everywhere on the planet. It was because of slavery and indentured labor that you find Black people left the African continent and can be found in Americas, Asia, and the Caribbean, and parts of Australia and Pacific. It was because of slavery and indentured labor. So we are very divisive amongst ourselves, and yes, African American. I want to try to put myself in their shoes, and this is why I do this work. So my heritage, like I said, is very much connected to that. My ancestors that came back to Liberia, they can be considered as African American. They came back with a lot of trauma. It's not easy to go through what they went through. So I'm trying my best to put myself in that case, even though I'm very angry and upset. That why would you continue to hold on to someone who abused you for centuries? But that's how trauma was. It's very deep and it has affected African American in a very adverse way. And one way I'm proposing that we actually deal with this division between especially African American, those in the Caribbean, and us from the continent, is to go to the roots of the problem and begin to talk about it for ourselves. We have not done that. In Liberia, we haven't dealt with it, and that's why we end up with 14 years of civil war, and it has destroyed that country. Because as Africans and as Liberians, we came back, those who came back, barely 10% of their population literally recolonized their own Black people. So talking about being self-critical, Liberia colonization is Black on Black. It wasn't, yes, the US Congress provided $100,000 to take those who wanted to go back to Africa on their Back to Africa movement. But of course, after 1847, the first ship arrived 1820. After 1847, when we declared independence, it's 2024. Come on, Liberia, please. I mean, excuse me? Like, it's very difficult, and I think we need to realistically, because this is not just Liberia's situation, our leaders on the continent have serious mental problem. Honestly, we need to be realistic about it. We need to engage. We need to talk about how it has impacted us. And that's how my mom has been able to pass on her trauma to me. And I'm struggling every day not to pass on my trauma to my son. It's real. And so unless we can have that systemic approach to facing each other and facing our demons, it's not easy. We will never get to that point of unity and loving each other. I always quote Malcolm X, who says, "Who taught you how to hate yourself?" We are so self-hated and self-destructive as Africans. And it has to do a lot with how the experience we went through with colonization, imperialization, imperialism, and slavery. But we can't continue to play the blame game. As you said, we need to take agency and work on ourselves. The second question, I'm not sure I understood. Can I try to rephrase it? But you said something about how do we fix or deal with systemic racial structure through AI, corporate AI? Incorporate, okay, incorporate, you mean, do you want to rephrase the question, please?
Yes, I'm looking at structural racism in corporates. And I'm curious how I can encourage them to think differently and to consider that there are mechanisms that are encouraging racism rather than stopping it.
Right.
So I would be curious to know what you would say to a corporate to encourage them to think differently about the structural racism that they currently hold.
Thank you for the question, thank you for clarifying. That's a very difficult question because the structure, I'm from Canada, I'm a proud Canadian, I love Canada. But one of the most structured systemic racist countries is Canada. And we don't talk about racism in Canada. And it's because it's so deeply rooted in the system, so it's hard to pinpoint. And of course, with my legal background, I have 3 degrees in law. With my legal background, I find it's one of those things that is just so hard to prosecute because it's systemic and it's structured. If somebody doesn't give you the job, you can say it's because I'm Black, because they interview you, but you just didn't get the job. And you cannot go behind them in their brains to understand why they didn't give you the job. But the system and the structures are put in place to make sure that certain people doesn't show up or doesn't represent. And that's why in the Canadian Parliament, you barely see Black people. And they would tell you they're not racist. But why don't you have Black people in our Canadian or Indigenous people in our Parliament? It's a system. My suggestion is, because it's a very difficult thing to do, and it's a mammoth. I think investing in younger people, and because the work is so amazing because it's focusing on young Africans. Young people, I believe, have the potential to really shake things up. I'm sorry to say, my mom doesn't have a cover. That's what my mom told me when I was a kid. I just speak my mind. I think as long as we have the old white men continuously ruling these places, we will never have those changes. It's very difficult, and that's realistic. And just looking at your graph, it's Meta having that huge histogram compared to the rest of the other. It's not something it's like hitting your head against the wall, and you don't want to do that. So my thing is investing in younger generation who are having different thinking processes and encouraging them to go to this extra lengths of being involved in these corporations or in a structure. It's not easy. Look, it's easy for me to say, encourage young people to go into it. I'm in this system and it's difficult to do. But what is it that is simple in life? After all, do you want life to just be simple? Please, come on. It's boring when it's so simple and there's no challenge. So encourage young people to shift the paradigm and take on those leadership roles that is old. I mean, these baby boomers are dying now. I don't know if it's a good thing, but when they leave, hopefully the younger generation can bring in some change. Thank you.
Again, I was gonna say quickly on the data has to be repatriated.
Yeah.
It has to go back to where, and those communities that it represents must be the ones who receive it back, and then there must be support for them on how then it can be used and whether it's skills transfer, because there's a lot of this. We've had this whether in health, in climate, where a lot of work has been done by different organizations, universities on the continent, and the data is here and is not even accessible to researchers on the continent itself. It is really, shameful in lots and lots of ways, yeah.
The one thing I find most fascinating with all the Insaka is how somehow we find a line between your work. And that was the exercise I gave you all, to find a line between their work. And I can appreciate with both of you the complexity that is working in and with and for the continent, both in terms of our positionality as being the researcher and the researched, but also from the system that we are having to build around ourselves as we do the research, that these things are not off the shelf, that the computer science professor is having to be a community mobilizer, that the indigenous researcher is having to be a researcher and a researcher and a legal professor and a community mobilizer as well. But at the core of it all is the sense that it's all deeply rooted in who we are as people, beyond the fancy methodologies, beyond the data, beyond everything else. It's who we are as people that takes things forward or backwards. So please join me in giving a huge cutting thank you. Our wonderful Esther has got something for us because we make sure that because Oxford is blue and red, we give you something bright and screaming. Esther, thank you very much. And please, mark your calendars today for the Insakas for the coming academic year on 25th October at 7 p.m. For people online, I've asked, how do I get involved? How do I get involved? Come and join the next Insaka. Also, please do sign up for the mailing. Take out your phone now, you're allowed. Scan the QR code, join the mailing list, and keep engaging with us. You can find us on social media, you can find our email address on our website, and do get involved. Again, to all of you for making it tonight, a big thank you for being here, and we can't wait to continue the conversation over drinks. Thank you so much. Announcement that Dr. Said Mutaru of the University of Cape Coast will be giving the Evans featured lecture on witchcraft in Northern Ghana. Mr. Tuesday the 7th at 5 p.m. at Walton College. Thank you very much.